wherever you're interacting with kids in schools or wherever, how is this adult relationship, which is a power authority relationship, what am I modeling in this moment?
Welcome to Talking About Kids. I am your host, R. Bradley Snyder, researcher, activist, and author of The 5 Simple Truths of Raising Kids. A couple of weeks ago, the Society for Research on Educational Effectiveness, or SREE, held its annual conference. At it, a study from 2015 received some new attention. That study is the Discipline and Participation, the long-term effects of suspension and school security on the political and civic engagement of youth, from the journal Youth and Society. My guests to talk about the study and its importance are the study's authors, Thomas Catlaw, and longtime friend of Talking About Kids, Aaron Kupchik. This podcast is sponsored in part by the Arizona Department of Health Services Must Stop Bullying campaign through its Title V Maternal and Child Health Program. For more information, go to muststopbullying.org. And now, the interview.
So for me, the origins of this and the work with Aaron kind of sits at an intersection of like three areas of interest that I've had. The first is that my kind of academic and professional training was in the area of public administration, and there's a long history going back to the 60s at least about how to think about governing democratically. So, of course, the work of governance and public administration is interested in supporting democratically elected leaders and carrying out, the policies developed in accordance with the desires and wishes of communities. But there's also been a lot of work done about how to think about doing or carrying out those policies and directives in a democratic fashion. And the primary vehicle for that has been public participation and civic engagement through governance processes and administrative systems. The second area I would say that has been an interest of me is a literature kind of more in Aaron's neck of the woods in sociology, and that is a literature going back to the 1930s that was thinking about forms of bureaucratic organization, and also thinking about thinking about and examining how forms of organization carry across different spheres and aspects of social life. So, for example, in liberal societies, we often think of civil society, markets, and the public sector as being the three legs of society. But we can also think about it in terms of how do similar forms of organization carry across and replicate themselves through those three sectors. So bureaucratic organization, for example, or forms of marketization more recently carry across, public, private, and nonprofit organizations. So there's a kind of what you might call a kind of structural similarity or homology across different kinds of society. And so that's been a source of interest to me as well. And third, there's a literature in political science and political theory that has thought about democracy with more of a small d. So less about, say, voting per se, which is the primary way in which we often think about democratic participation. But to use a phrase from John Dewey, the great American philosopher, and obviously has a huge impact on education in the United States, thinking about democracy as a way of life or a way of relating to one another, and not only about forms of institutions. And so really, like, those things come together for me to think about how patterns of relationship, ways of interacting are kind of the flesh on the bones of democratic institutions. And so how do we think about cultivating democratic capacities democratic abilities, democratic citizenship, that can be reinforcing and, complementary to the democratic institutions like voting and things that are a little bit more visible to us. So civic participation and public participation becomes one of the primary ways or lenses and vehicles through which you can think about building democratic capacity on an individual, organizational, or social level that helps to reinforce and really make possible the
Mhm.
efficacy of democratic institutions.
And Aaron, I know that your work also has gotten kind of increasingly contextual. You're not just looking at what's happening inside schools and classrooms, but you're putting it in a larger cultural context and not just talking about the ecological model, but you're looking at kind of the history of other forces, kind of some of the things that Tom was referencing there. What got you thinking about the link between what was happening in the classroom and future civic engagement?
Well, I have long been interested in, I don't know, to use a phrase that's probably used in so many different ways, but the hidden curriculum of schooling, of education,
Mm,
right? So not just what students learn, um, academically, but how they're socialized and what other lessons about living in contemporary society they learn. Um, from a socialization perspective, we can think about schools as teaching children what their role in society is.
right.
And so I've long been concerned with particularly how discipline and harsh discipline, particularly in policing in schools, teaches children about society and their role in it, what power they have, what kind of place they have. So if you go back, when there's sort of a long tradition, particularly from a Marxist perspective, of thinking of schools as training people for their future roles in society, their future roles in capitalist society, whether they're going to be workers or whether they're going to be managers,
Hmm.
in particular. The most common type of analysis going back to the 60s, like this. Was more interested in what kinds of lessons about their role in society kids learn from school discipline, particularly given that school discipline is harmful in so many other ways. The research has found. So that sort of started my interest in thinking about socialization. But the other part of it was, after having done research, particularly ethnographic research on the ground, where I'm in schools watching how kids get punished, it just really disturbed me and struck me across schools the similarity in how, to follow from what Tom was talking about, undemocratic the schools can be, even though they're supposed to be a cornerstone of democratic participation in society. They're supposed to be foundational. And what I mean by that is, well, maybe the best illustration of that is a zero tolerance policy. A zero tolerance policy communicates that there is no context, no room for discussion. It's a one size fits all rule. Well, so for example, if you have a weapon that you brought to school, you're expelled.
Hmm.
And it doesn't matter if you work, after school at Home Depot and you forgot to take a razor blade out of, that you use for opening boxes, out of your bag. That's a weapon. And so zero tolerance policy doesn't see the difference, at least as it's written, between that box cutter, I should say, and a knife that would be more likely to be used in an assault or for personal defense. And these zero tolerance policies are just so fundamentally, I would say, even anti-democratic. They're teaching children that the context doesn't matter. There's no room for dialogue,
Right.
for debate, that the power is imbued only in the rule and the school administrator. It's not dispersed in any way towards a community. And that really got me thinking about what students who run up against these kinds of rules and disciplinary structures, what kinds of lessons and what
Right.
kind of socialization uh, they learn.
I mean, it's so interesting. And you brought up the zero tolerance policy around school weapons. And some of my listeners are going to be familiar with a case that happened where a young girl was in the process of surrendering a weapon that she brought to school because she recognized that she didn't want it, that it was wrong, that she was that she wanted to do the right thing. In the process of surrendering the weapon in the offices, that's what triggered her arrest. And so, to your point, to Tom's point, what is that young student? And she was very young. I think she was 11 or 12. What does that incident teach that young student about structures, about organizations, about something like an institution like a school, which is equated with a public institution? A lot of what both of you are talking about, though, is fairly theoretical. As you pointed out, these different philosophers have talked about this in a theoretical way, but you both went about trying to kind of look at this relationship in a quantitative way. Tell me about the analysis that went into kind of putting some numbers around this relationship between school discipline and civic engagement.
Well, I'm going to let Aaron comment mostly on the analysis, but what I would just sort of maybe preface the comment by saying is that these theses about um, democracy and I should have mentioned what are sometimes called democratic spillover effects. So the idea that the schools, families, churches, what have you, end up developing abilities and capacities that subsequently become relevant for um, for democratic practice more broadly, that it has been sort of stubbornly unexamined empirically, actually. I mean, it seems to make a lot of intuitive sense that these kinds of socialization and capacity building processes would have more broad social implications, but they have not been studied extensively empirically, and it turns out it's pretty difficult to do that. And so I think the exciting thing about the paper is that it really does try to grapple with these difficult theoretical questions and take on the difficult empirical work of trying to get our hands around it a little bit. So with that, I'll just turn it over to Aaron.
Sure. So we were able to use a data set called the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health. That is this enormous federally funded undertaking from the UNC, University of North Carolina Population Center. They have been collecting and working with these data for a couple decades now, where they started in the 90s interviewing young people and their teachers and their parents about all sorts of characteristics of their lives and their education. And they followed up with them in successive waves. And we were able to use 4 separate waves of this. So by that, I mean that they re interviewed these kids and their parents, in some cases, their teachers. They re interviewed them multiple times. So we had 4 separate waves of collecting the data, which allows us to look at how youth who are suspended while they're quite young, whether or not, or the probability of them voting and volunteering in their communities 13 years later. So quite a bit after they're done with school. And because it's such a thorough data collection instrument, we're able to statistically control for, account for all sorts of other competing explanations, but factors, for example, students' academic performance, whether their parents vote and volunteer, other risky behavior, or excuse me, not other, but risky behaviors that they might engage in, and so on. Um, and see, even after accounting for all those things, how a history of suspension affects voting and volunteering in their communities.
And it just brief, and we're going to have a link to the paper so that the listeners can read it because they're also readers. But what did you find? What do the data show?
Well, the results showed that youth who are suspended are less likely to vote or to volunteer in their communities years later, 13 years later. So there's a long-term influence of school discipline on these behaviors, on civic participation, well over a decade later.
You know, Tom, you had kind of pointed to the kind of why this is important to look at. But I want to explore. what exactly you think that means? What is going on where somebody who is suspended is, not engaged civically moving forward, and what the repercussions of that are?
Well, I think, what is going on there is something that I think is hard to answer directly based upon the analysis that we did. I think what we talk about in the paper is that these forms of disciplinary practice in schools um, communicate lessons around relationships to authority,
Mhm.
fundamentally, that students learn to become passive in the face of authority, that they learn that their voices really don't matter, that ultimately they can be removed physically and you might say emotionally as well from important communities that play major roles in their lives. Um, and I think this has profound implications um, for democratic practice and for the future of kids more generally. If even if we set aside the implications for democracy, which is pretty significant, right? I mean, teaching kids to be passive in the face of authority, to teach them that ultimately that their voices don't count, that they don't really have the kind of influence in the shaping of their lives that we would like to think that we would have as adults. I think cultivates a strong long-term sense of
Mm,
passivity and resignation potentially among people to accept states of affairs that are inequitable, unjust, or otherwise simply harmful to them because they feel like, well, ultimately, um, there are people with more power and more influence than I have, and that's just the way things are. The flip side of to that is, in some sense, equally troubling to me, which is that the reasonable path to resolving that situation is to get oneself into a position of
right.
power so one can
Mm,
subsequently interact with people in the way in which you have
right.
been treated. And I think that, we can think about how forms of whether it's organizational authority or managerial authority across organizations functions and why the desire for being in those positions of power becomes so important. And even politically, the sociologist Ulrich Beck talked about forms of representative democracy being essentially sort of democratically elected monarchies, where we have a sort of systematic rotation of people who exercise a strong sort of power rather than a more kind of dynamic dialogic form of
Right.
power. So I think it affects how kids and later on adults think about their lives and the efficacy that they can have in their lives. But I also think at a real core level, it really shapes how we think about power and the exercise of power in relationship and over other people. And that to me, sets us up for all sorts of really negative social consequences in terms of how we think about the dynamics of power between each other.
I want to focus on just one of the consequences that you talked about there, because maybe, I have some listeners who are thinking, well, these kids are getting suspended because clearly they've done something harmful or dangerous in their schools. Aaron, you've looked a lot at why kids get suspended or expelled. Is it the case that these are all kids that are being very harmful to the other kids around them and to that learning environment?
Absolutely not. The vast majority of school disciplinary cases, including suspensions, are for really trivial behaviors. They can be nuisances, they can be problematic for teachers who are trying to do their jobs, but they're not harmful necessarily. They're not violent, they're not drug offending. So the vast majority of school discipline is for example, insubordination or willful defiance or cursing or dress code violations, for not obeying the school rules, essentially. Um, another common one, maybe one of my favorites, is truancy, right? So kids don't
Mm,
come to school, so as a result, we kick them out of school for a short period of time. Um, Very rare. It's really rare that there's true violence, including even, your typical kind of school fight, is really a small percentage of school discipline, over the behaviors that result in school discipline. So most kids who get in trouble in school, most kids who get suspended, it's for really pretty minor misbehavior, nuisance behavior, not this is a bad kid behavior, not others are in danger, physical danger behavior.
On talking about kids, we've looked often at the fact that schools tend to reward a very narrow set of capacities, and that schools can be very sort of even dangerous places for kids who are neurodivergent or simply have a different perspective. And so, if I can maybe dumb down what I'm hearing from you, Tom, and you, Aaron, is that we are taking kids that are simply different. Their behavior, their outlook, their patterns don't fit within a very narrow mold that the school is trying to put them in, and as a result, we end up losing that perspective over the long term because when they become of age to make a difference in the system, maybe to kind of engage in the kind of civic leadership or participation that could potentially bring a different perspective to some of these issues, they've already been alienated. Am I saying that correctly?
Well, I think I would probably Aaron and Brad, you all are more knowledgeable than I am about the context of schools. What I would, I guess, say is that at least in, say, the organizational management context that I'm most familiar with or more familiar with, is that it's very clear that organizations uh, spend a lot of time, often ex post, trying to figure out how to mobilize and integrate diverse opinions and diverse points of view, because it's even if it isn't always played out in practice. I think rhetorically, there's, I mean, and empirically, a lot of evidence about the importance of forms of diversity and difference in organizational settings for all sorts of performance issues related to organizational outcomes and so on and so forth. But we don't do a good job about training people or acclimating people to the work of being comfortable in those
Mm,
environments, by being able to listen and critically reflect upon, about being able to be in the presence of a wide variety of points of view and not feel uncomfortable necessarily or not feel forms of resistance. And so a lot of the work that I would do in the classroom and in teaching in organizational behavior settings, for example, is sort of a lot of unlearning of the habits that we had developed through most of our adolescence and childhood about what our role is, when to speak, when not to
right.
speak, when to how to and so it's not that I feel that, like, I know schools are under a lot of pressure and teachers are under a lot of pressure. It's hard work, and so I feel reluctant to sometimes come to the conclusion and say, okay, now you're responsible for the future of democracy. That's a lot to take on. Um, but at the same time, I think what I would hope our paper would inspire is a kind of reflection among adults, particularly adults in positions of authority and positions where their power can be exercised in ways that might influence people's futures, to think about this question. In other words, to think about, in their relationship with kids, in their relationship
Right.
wherever you're interacting with kids in schools or wherever, how is this adult relationship, which is a power authority relationship, what am I modeling in this moment, and what kind of what kind of adult ultimately am I thinking that I'm helping to habituate? And I think that for me is the meaningful thing about this work, and hopefully, the idea of thinking, here I am in this setting, I'm in this position of power, and I have this kind of influence. How am I going to exercise this authority? Am I going, and I do have the opportunity to exercise it democratically and to make those kinds of choices. It's often a lot
Mm,
harder. It's harder, but I think what we try to do in the paper is communicate that there are potentially real stakes in those choices that we make.
Aaron?
Yeah, if I can add to that, I think Tom raises just fabulous points. And to echo and maybe elaborate on one small part of that, um, just thinking about the relationships we're building and what we're communicating to students, I think is very important. Um, you know, I've had many teachers tell me over the course of work I've done in schools that the most common reason that students misbehave in class is because they don't understand the academic material. And so this deflects attention from them maybe feeling stupid, or if you're having negative feelings about that, um, towards maybe approval as class clown or as a way to get out of class. And what we do typically is we kick them out of school or class at the very least, so they fall farther behind. We're also communicating to them that they're a problem, right? So their lack of understanding the material makes them a problem. So this is both a problem of the feelings we're creating in them and what we're teaching, how we're communicating, but also a matter of policy, right? So our policy, our practice is to remove them from class rather than say tutor them, or rather than have the funding to hire school aides that can take them independently and work with them on the material. Um, but in part, it's a matter of policy. We've chosen as a country to suspend children from school, to kick them out of school, despite the fact that it fails at any potential real policy goal. It doesn't improve that child's behavior.
Right.
It doesn't help the students that aren't suspended long term. It
Right.
might help the teacher for a short period of time, but that kid comes back worse. So it doesn't help their classmates. It doesn't help the school's overall rate of misbehavior. So in the end, it really achieves nothing. It's a counterproductive, harmful policy, but that's what we've invested in quite a bit. The last part of that I want to talk about, last night I finally got around to watching the Mr. Rogers documentary, Won't You Be My Neighbor? And we all know Mr. Rogers, and I'm just struck at how his, one of his overall philosophies is just to how important it is to communicate to children that they are loved and that they are capable of
Mhm.
loving. And that's the exact opposite of what we do too often in schools. And like Tom, I don't want to denigrate teachers who are, man, do they have a hard job, with too little pay and everybody telling them that they're doing it wrong constantly, including us at times, right? But not my intent, certainly. So it's important to think about how the types of disciplines that we use, like suspending kids out of school, communicate to children that they're a problem to be managed, not someone who we love and want to improve.
It's probably a mark of really good scholarship when it's being talked about well after it was published. It's got to feel good that you published this in 2015, and for it to be raised at one of the major conferences on education just a week and a half ago. It shows me that you, as I've known since I first met you both, are well ahead of your time. And I want to thank you so much on behalf of kids for thinking about these issues and doing the hard work. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Brad, and thank you for all the work you do here on the podcast. I am a dedicated listener, and I learn a lot every time I tune in. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Brad. It's great to be back on. Thank you for talking about the important issue and all the work you're doing.
That was Thomas Catlaw and Aaron Kupchik. For more information about Tom and Aaron, as well as a link to their study, please visit the website talkingaboutkids.com. From there, you also can find out about upcoming episodes, suggest a topic, learn more about me and my books, or submit your questions for future guests. Our theme song is by the Senators. For more of their music, go to thesenatorsmusic.com. And remember, kids are young goats and young humans. And the difference is that young goats are easier to manage.